Welcome, everyone. I'm glad to have you with us today. We might have some late arrivals that continue to join us, but for the sake of our short time together in this moment, we'll go ahead and begin. My name is Allie Drescher, and I am the Senior Director of Mission-Based Services at Alive Hospice. Part of my role entails overseeing Alive's Grief Center, and this is a role that is personally and professionally really dear to my heart. So I'm grateful for the time that you've allotted to share with us today, and I hope that you'll find this session to be useful. A couple of notes before we begin. We are going to ask that you remain on mute. There is a chat box if you want to share something and express yourself that way. You'll also find a Q&A feature to ask a question of myself and our team that's also on the call today. If you'd like to submit a question that way, you're welcome to do so. And toward the end of our time together, we will remain on the call. If you are ready to go ahead and leave after you receive information, you're welcome to log off when you're ready. But if anyone wants to stay and ask a question individually or in front of a smaller group, you'll have the opportunity to do that at the end of the session. So hopefully you're familiar with Alive, but I wanted to share a couple of things about who we are and what we do, and we'll talk about some of the grief support opportunities that we have here for the community a little later on in the presentation. Alive is Middle Tennessee's only nonprofit hospice, and we've been here since 1975. And a hospice organization does really great work. What we are able to do as a nonprofit hospice is offer some programs to the community and extensive services with regard to grief support that maybe other hospices don't have the opportunity to do. So we not only take care of patients as they are nearing the end of their life, but support their families and provide education to the community at large about how we can live knowing that death is a part of life and how we can maybe potentially better embrace that. I want to begin today by acknowledging that the reason that many of us are on this call is due to what transpired last week at the Covenant School. And I know that for many of us, it's been feeling really heavy since then. That might not be the only traumatic experience or community trauma that you have had or encountered in your life, as they just keep feeling like they're stacking up and adding up on top of each other, whether it's a flood, a tornado, the downtown bombing a few years ago, and now the shooting at the Covenant School. I think our hearts are pretty weary and maybe look like the picture that we see on the slide here. But I love this quote. It says, "The closest bonds we will ever know are the bonds of grief, the deepest community, one of sorrow." It's an interesting juxtaposition of what the grief experience is like, that in the midst of that, it somehow connects us. And if you are here today and you've been personally impacted or indirectly impacted by last week's shooting, I want you to know that you're not alone, that there are plenty on the call that probably have significant amount of empathy for you and are feeling what you're going through. Not that they can know it exactly, but that they're trying to bear some of the weight and the burden of that on your behalf. So even though we are reeling from all of the lives that were lost last week, I just want to remind us that for the purpose of this conversation today, we are going to stay focused on children's grief specifically. Of course, there are so many other things that we could talk about and elements at play with regard to this particular situation, but we will hone in on how best to support young people who are hurting and grieving in the wake of this event and others in their own life. And just remember that there is such a thing as collective or communal grief. So you might be wondering for yourself why you feel so impacted by bearing witness to what happened last week. But it is common because we are human beings that can relate to one another and live in relationship to each other, that oftentimes these situations tug at our own heartstrings, regardless of our proximity to the loss. So we honor that today in this time together. And I also want to share with you that something else can happen in the wake of a community tragedy. And it's known as something called the violation of the assumptive world. And what it means basically is that sometimes we progress throughout our day thinking certain things are true. We're safe here. We can rely on this person. We know certain events are going to unfold throughout our day. But when something so traumatic and unexpected arises in our community, it causes us to pause and question, am I even safe here? How does this fit into how I make sense of the world around me? And what does this mean for me and my family, the children that I love going forward? So if you find yourself in that spot today, asking a lot of those types of questions, again, know that you're not alone. It's a common part of the experience of adjustment after loss and how our brains try and make sense of things. Of course, we know in this situation there is so much that we can't make sense of. And so together we will learn how to support each other as we live with that ambiguity and the unsolvable nature of what transpired. I'm going to take just a brief pause in acknowledgement of the lives lost last week before we continue with our content. I hope maybe that you inhaled and exhaled as I did. I don't know if you could hear that over the microphone, but I needed that moment. Thank you. I thought it would be best for us to start today by just talking about how we define grief. There's a lot of ideas and myths about what grief looks like and what it means for people. And I want to make sure that we're all on the same page before we go forward. So, regardless of age, let's think a little bit about what grief actually is. Grief is known to be our mostly internal response of responding to the death of someone or something that we care about. But it may not always be a death. It could be a life loss, a transition that we've had, a move, a house fire, loss of a job. There are all sorts of circumstances that we face in our life that evoke this internal process known as grief. In addition to that, you might hear people use the word mourning, which is known to be more of our external response and what we share with our community and friends, the rituals pertaining to how we're feeling on the inside. And another word you might hear is the word bereavement, which just means the separation from something that you want to be connected with. So, what we have to look at now for young people and ourselves as adults is that we're likely suffering from many layers of loss and grief. Some of them are really present and visible and noticeable to those around us. Others are a little bit more psychologically based and can reside in our hearts or our minds in a way that might feel disenfranchised from our communities. But it's important to recognize that they're there and relevant as well. When we define grief, it's important to remember this. Each person's grief has its own fingerprint. Every journey of sorrow has a unique map. I think that's a beautiful way to describe the fact that the grief response is completely and highly individualized. It is as unique as we are. And what's interesting is that even as individuals, we don't respond in grief the same way to every loss we encounter. Sometimes we might feel like we can quickly adjust to life after that loss transpires. And other times we are deeply impacted. Our ability to cope and function in the world might be prohibited for a while, or it might take months or years for us to adapt to the loss. And that's okay. One thing that we tend to do, though, when we're grieving and when we're witnessing other people's grief is to judge it. And that's something that we want to steer clear of, especially when we are working with young people. We might say they seem to be crying too much or not enough, or maybe they're staying home too much and they should be more social. It's time to get on and move over and get back to normal. These are all value statements that say something about how we view how we might want to cope with grief, but it may not apply to their individualized nature of grief and mourning. So we want to honor the fingerprint and allow people to have space to grieve in the way that they need to. So, as we go forward in this conversation, remember there's no one set strategy that will apply to all people. Grief is also context based, meaning it depends on where you are geographically located, your family of origin, your ethnicity. It's culturally and spiritually informed. So, who you are going into the loss will shape how you experience it, what you lean on as you go through it, and your beliefs about why it's happening in your life. The other thing we have to factor in our conversation today is the developmental level of the children that we're supporting. So I want you to remember that sometimes when we talk about young children, we think of them by age. We classify them into classrooms with, about a year's worth of children around the same age in that group. And while it's easy to talk about children in that way pertaining to their age, I want you to think of them from a developmental level because we may have a 5-year-old that has exceeded milestones and operates more like a 7-year-old. Or we might have another 5-year-old that hasn't hit those same milestones yet and maybe operating on a developmental level more like 3 years old. So really assess that child in front of you and think about where they are in their development. And that's going to tell you a lot about how they might grieve. Now, I imagine those of you on the call today are here because you experience children in your life, either professionally or personally, and they might be at different ages. So you might look at some of the content today and say, that doesn't apply to my child. But I want you to remember that it's likely that you might want to have that information. It might be a neighbor down the street or someone you encounter in your faith organization or whatever the case may be. It's important to understand how grief impacts children of all ages, even if it doesn't apply in our own household. So we're going to cover that today. And at some point, you will see your child's current developmental level included in our slides today. The most important thing that we need to address right off the bat is that sometimes our first response in the wake of such a tragic circumstance is to find a way to fix it. And isn't that a beautiful part of humanity that we want to step in and make things better when something so difficult happens? So I'm not taking away from that. But sometimes our attempt to fix things can get in the way of really good grief support. So at Alive's Grief Center, our philosophical approach to grief is that it is a natural, normal, expected response that helps us adjust to the loss that occurred. So remember this. Grief is not a problem to be solved. It is an experience to be carried. And our goal of today's conversation is to help just a little bit feel better equipped to stand in this moment, as awkward, as uncomfortable, and as painful as it might be, but to be able to support the young people in our lives from this perspective, that we admit that we can't make it better. And I know we probably all feel like we wish we could solve it and take it away, turn back time, intervene differently, do whatever we can do to prevent such a thing from happening. But since we're not in that situation, our goal as grief support individuals is to simply show up, to be present, and to allow that person to experience it for what it is without trying to take it away. So just keep that in mind as we go today. You might be wondering how often grief impacts a child under the age of 18. And I think sometimes we like to envision childhood to be this magical kingdom where nothing bad happens and certainly no one dies. But we know that that's not the case. And we know this through research. So I wanted to share these stats with you. In Tennessee, 1 in 10 children experience the death of a parent or a sibling before they turn 18. That means in every classroom across Middle Tennessee, there's at least one grieving student at any given time. About 152,000 grieving students or young people. And what's really interesting is that unfortunately, Tennessee ranks 7th in the rate of the occurrence of childhood bereavement in the United States. So there's a significant number of grieving children in our communities that need our support. And if we bump that number up to the age of 25, it more than doubles. So there's about 366,000 children in our state by the age of 25 who will have experienced the death of a sibling or a parent. And that's a significant number, and it doesn't account for uh, losses that on paper are not related to them. But we know how children operate, their peer systems, their support groups, their schools. Sometimes that has more relevance to them than their families do. So the deaths that occur in their community, if you'll allow me to use that word, might even feel more significant in some cases, and they're not represented here. So there's a lot of pain to go around. And I say that not to be negative or to feel overwhelming, because I know we are all tired as it is, but to remind us of how important it is to intervene on young people's behalf in this way, because it is happening all around us. But here's the good news right off the bat. There are some protective factors that we know through research can thwart negative outcomes for people who have experienced an early life loss in adulthood. And I want to share some of those with you because you are a part of the solution. Having a caring community and positive role models, healthy coping skills, a lot of peer support, educators who will show up and respond for their needs, and then having really stable caregivers in their home. These are all things that can help prevent those unwanted outcomes of an early loss in life, even into adulthood. And so it's important for us to be willing, again, to just embrace the awkward nature of this situation and try and assist people in these areas so they do feel like they've got the skills and the support that they need to face their future in the wake of loss. I think about 20, 30 years ago, there was an idea that maybe children didn't grieve. Certainly, the idea was that they grieved much differently than adults did, but maybe, they weren't all that impacted by the loss because developmentally, how could they even understand what forever meant or what death actually was? But we know that this is not true. Generally, we can state it this way: if you're old enough to love, you are indeed old enough to grieve. Again, I mean developmentally here. Remember that children in America are bearing witness to themes about death and dying all the time. That might be in their religious upbringing. It might be thanks to Mr. Disney, who includes a death theme in a lot of his movies. Interesting research pertaining to that, what happened in his own life, and why those themes are there. Maybe we have a household where the TV is turned on a lot and the child is hearing and learning about death through the media. Or maybe it's social media, even in the hands of a young child, where they're starting to hear these stories. The problem, if you will, is that sometimes we are allowing them to be exposed to these themes, but we're not quick to give them information and understanding about what that means for them or their role in all of it. So, for example, I share this with you. If I, as a parent, have a fishbowl at home and I go to the fishbowl one day and poor beloved Goldie is no longer swimming, but she is floating on the surface. If my children are out of the house that day, I'm going to be tempted to say, do I have time to get to the pet store and get a look-alike Goldie and replace poor Goldie that is no longer living? Why do we do that? Sometimes we want to shield young children from really difficult conversations. Other times it's because we are also uncomfortable with the concept of death and the afterlife and why these things happen. And therefore, it prompts us to kind of steer away from it altogether. And this is probably the biggest thing that you can take away today, I think, from our time together is just resisting the temptation to avoid this topic and to hope it will go away on its own is the most significant thing we can do for a grieving young person because there's so much power in acknowledging what's happened. And since our society has a tendency to avoid talking about aging, death, and life after death, then we have a tendency to not give children an opportunity to explore little losses, if you will, along the way. And then something significant happens to them and they don't have practice in how you might adjust in the wake of a loss. They don't see modeling from their adults on how you might respond when you're grieving. They don't know what's healthy in that circumstance. I'm making a sweeping generalization here, so you may do things differently in your household or in your community, and I'm glad for that. But America is known to be pretty death denying, and it sets us up for a lot of problems when we're steering young people through this experience with grief. So we have to remember that grief impacts every level of functioning that we have as human beings. We tend to think of grief as being an emotional response to loss, and it is that, but that's not it. It impacts us cognitively, physically, emotionally, spiritually, socially, and on. Grief lives in both the head and the heart. And that's why you might be feeling like, man, I'm usually pretty good at handling tough stuff. I've been through a lot in my life and I'm typically okay. But coming up against this loss, this feels really different. This is why. So, regardless of age or developmental level, we all experience this. You might have noticed in the last week that you feel a little foggy, maybe extra tired. Maybe you've had some stomach aches. Maybe you haven't wanted to connect with friends, or you've been really anxious to connect with friends. That is grief's response on the total being that each one of us has, and how deeply we can be impacted, of course, is going to go back to that fingerprint and be different for each person. But it is going to meet us on absolutely every level. So one thing that I think is lacking probably from this slide that I can adjust is educationally as well. And so for our young people, we have to remember that they're encountering this likely within their school days. And because of the shooting at the Covenant School, that can be really complicated. And we have about 7 groups going on right now in schools all across Middle Tennessee. We offer a free program to schools and provide grief support and education to students directly during the school day. And we are hearing a trend in this second week since the shooting took place of students feeling unsafe and uncertain, being concerned about certain doors that they aren't sure lock, or where their classroom is in relationship to the security officer at their school. Lots of things starting to come up here. So sometimes school is really a respite for children. And right now it may be exacerbating some of their feelings related to grief. So remember that a death in the family or in the community is going to impact even a young griever. So they may not be able to cognitively understand what's transpired, because who can? Even adults struggle with that, myself included. But they'll notice that something's different. They might wonder why adults are whispering in the kitchen and somehow they know they probably shouldn't go in there. Or they start to realize that the person that used to play games with them after school is maybe laying in the bed crying instead. And they will typically insert themselves into the center of the storyline. So they start to wonder what they did to cause that. They often have a sense of feeling left out. Remember that one of our deepest human needs related to attachment is that children need to feel like they are known, they're received, they are seen and heard. And that gives them that sense of having a secure base in their life. And when that might be threatened because the adults in their life are acting a little bit differently, they can get concerned then that maybe it has something to do with them. So children will have a tendency to feel us and experience us. A colleague in the field said this a couple of weeks ago, and I thought it's so true. They can pick up on our own energy and might be responding in response to that energy that we're putting off. And so we have to remember we want to be genuine with our feelings and not hide anything from them. But this is why it's so important for us to address it, and especially to be willing to admit that we as adults are grieving too. And that can set young children up for feeling safe in the midst of this. From a developmental perspective, a school age child, again, making some generalizations about their development, we might see some acting out, although through research we know that doesn't happen as much as we think that it does. But there are subtle changes to eating and sleeping habits, um, feeling somatic complaints like stomach aches or headaches. That's really common. Worrying, of course, can be increased. That's not surprising. But one that I think might trip up adults who are providing support is the emotional outbursts that young people can have, coupled with a perceived absence of grief. And so we tend to talk about children as being puddle jumpers. In accordance with their attention span, they will move in and out of tough stuff. So that's why you might have a 7-year-old who is weeping at the thought of this thing having happened in their life. And then just a couple minutes later, maybe they look up at you and they say, "Can I go play now?" Now, we as adults might be thinking, "Whew, this is great. We never have to talk about this again. Grief is done." But that's just how they operate. And I think adults do that too. We can only handle so much of a really tough thing without needing to set it aside for a while and take a break from it. So we don't want to misinterpret that behavior that children have. And the other one that's really hard for adults is repetitive questioning. Years ago, I worked with a young woman who had a 4-year-old and was expecting her second child when her spouse was killed in a car accident. And after that event, a few weeks later, she brought her 4-year-old in to see me and was concerned that maybe there was something wrong with him because she said that they talked about his daddy every morning at breakfast and kissed pictures of him, and that they had talked about the fact that he had died. But every afternoon when her 4-year-old got up from his nap, he would say to her, "When will daddy be home?" So she was really concerned that maybe something wasn't clicking for him to understand that daddy wasn't coming home. But it was perfectly appropriate at 4 years old at that developmental level to need to ask the question over and over again. So instead of working with him, our outreach was really with her to understand that this was a normal part of the grief process, but to help her feel like she could face that every day because it's taxing on adults to have to explain over and over and over what's transpired. It's really exhausting in a lot of circumstances. And so it can be hard to have to do, but really important because children learn through repetition. So they need to hear that. We have to remember that children are great observers, but their interpretive skills haven't quite developed yet. So think about this. They're taking in the world around them, but they don't necessarily know what all of it means and they can't make sense of it. And what happens is then if we don't fill in the gaps of what's transpired, they will likely come up with their own story. And oftentimes those stories are even worse than the reality of what happened. So for the school age child, they're going to make really clear, concrete connections through things. It might sound like this. My grandparent went to the hospital. My grandparent died at the hospital. The hospital killed my grandparent. I am never going to the hospital. They're making these really literal links. Well, we need to stand in that gap and be willing to give them a smidge more information so they understand what happened, so they're not making links that aren't useful for them over time. So one question that we get often is, should we talk to children about it if they're not bringing it up on their own? And obviously, you all know those children in your life better than I do. So I would say trust your instinct and your gut first and foremost. It's likely right. But generally speaking, one thing that we can do when we're not sure how much our child knows or whether or not we should bring up this tough subject is to simply just gauge it by saying, "What have you heard?" And this kind of allows children freedom as well, where they're not having to report to you how they're feeling about it, but they can say, "Well, my friend told me A, B, and C." And then that's your opportunity for you to ask, "And how do you feel about that?" And then if they have questions, you can go from there. But again, we want to not take their silence and not talking about it as if it doesn't need to be talked about, because often it does. Now, not always through talk, and I'll say more about that in just a minute. So when a major crisis of this type of nature occurs, it's a really good idea to bring the topic up to them, no matter how young they are. Because again, they are going to try and fill in those gaps if we don't do it for them. Generally, it's not a good idea to force children to talk, though. So we're simply putting it out there and seeing how they respond to it, and making a commitment to ourselves that we are going to put it out there again over time. So it may be this week, it might be a conversation next week, it could be 3 months from now checking in. But we want to at least lead by putting it out there. And if they don't take you up on the offer, that's okay. So as we continue on thinking about how children want to talk about what's transpired, remember that Play is really the language of children, especially school-age children. And this can really stress adults out. Let's say a death has occurred and you notice that your child starts drawing pictures of people dying or maybe guns in this example. Know that that's okay. That is part of their process to be able to make sense of or put to rest, if you will, something really tough that's transpired. A lot of our therapeutic interventions use play therapy techniques, expressive arts, and giving children a way to explore and process and experience what they've been through in a safe, externalized way so that it's not re traumatizing to them, but in a way that's most comfortable to them. So I think most of us on the call probably agree that sometimes things are so horrible, they're just hard to put into words. And so for children who haven't developed the vocabulary that we have at our developmental level, it's even that much harder. So we want to provide outlets where they're expressing themselves. And again, most of that is good. What we notice over time is that there might be a redundancy in playing out that death, but in days, weeks, or months, it dissipates. And you might notice that instead of drawing guns, they're drawing flowers. And that is their way of processing what they've been through. So we really want to encourage that. Sometimes, though, children fear or might experience some social withdrawal. They might feel different than their peers and their friends. They definitely don't know those statistics about 1 in 10 children experiencing a death before they turn 18. So they feel like this has happened to them and only them. And that's why peer support is so important when we're grieving. Another theme that emerges for young grievers is something we call magical thinking. And that is because they have a really great and developed imaginations where they will start to think maybe they can control the circumstance in some way if they think about it hard enough. So we all wonder after a tragic event like last week what we could have done differently or how we could intervene, even when it's obvious that there isn't anything we could have done or known in advance. And for children, they might feel really helpless because they're not even a part of the adult community decision making experience. So let children know that this is a common reaction, wishing that there was something that we could do or could have done. And then suggest that you can concentrate on what can be done now for those that are in need, for those that are hurting, ideas and plans to help them feel like they've got some control that's rooted in the reality of their experience versus magical thinking. And let me remind us that adults are not immune to magical thinking as well. It sounds like this: if only we hadn't let them drive, if only I had returned their phone call. If we could have made a different decision, then this wouldn't have happened. That's our magical thinking at play, just in an adult format. But it's just us trying to grasp at some understanding and sense making and meaning making of the experience. And oftentimes it just leads us to more frustration, more questions, and more unknowns. So you'll really want to guide your young grievers through that. When we look at tweens or maybe middle school age, they can get kind of fixated on what happens at the time of death. And again, for adults who haven't come to terms with that on their own, that can be really difficult to address, but they want to know exactly what happens to the body. So that's a shift that you'll see developmentally. They might view death as something that's happened to them or because of them, and they will start to get focused on their own potential death or within their family. So they're making that link. If this can happen out in the community, what if this would happen to me? They need answers when possible. They need space to discuss it. And if it's not with you, that's okay. A practice in my own parenting life is I will ask my children periodically, who's your person or who are your people? Who do you go to? And as long as they have a few names on that list that they can spit out to me pretty rapidly, then I'm okay. My name doesn't have to be on it. So just make sure that they've got their confidants that they can go to. They will need safe boundaries and you as an outlet, and then real acceptance of their emotions, whatever that might look like. Again, setting aside that judgment piece and just letting them be where they are. For teens, they start to move into that full understanding of death and more adult like in their response. They could have a little risk-taking behavior, some changes in their friendships, but this is correlating with their moral development that's also taking place at the same time. So they might be thinking lots of existential questions. Why has this happened to me? And what does it mean for my life? And why am I here anyway? And then they can also get focused on vengeance or on trying to be a part of a solution. And so you'll see a lot of high school age students, college students who might be on at the Capitol as a part of opportunities and rallies for people to have their voices be heard. This is a natural inclination that we have after death, and especially in a tragic community death like what we experienced at the Covenant School. So your teens as well need space to make meaning and sense of their experience, whatever that looks like for them. They need the opportunity to ask questions, but here's the tricky thing with teens. I'm sure many of you already know, they aren't very quick to come to us and ask for help. So we have to make ourselves so available or someone so available to them so that they can at least identify where they're going to go when they decide that they're willing to explore it a little bit. And then support from their peers is important as well so that they feel grounded in who they are. And what's really interesting when we study post loss growth is that it's about your perceived support system that makes the difference. So it's not the actual number of support people that we have or friends that we have in our life that makes a difference. It's do we perceive to be well supported by our community and peers at large? And that perception of support helps us grow. Sometimes people will ask me, how do I know what to tell a child and how much is too much and how do I gauge that? Again, you know your children better than I, so I'm making some generalizations here, but really simply I can share with you that I like to think about giving information as if I'm serving pizza for lunch. And if I'm serving pizza for lunch to a 5-year-old or a 17-year-old, it's going to look a lot different. For that 5-year-old, I might cut one slice into teeny tiny pieces, maybe making sure there's a pepperoni on every other one, but it's going to be very bite-sized. Then I'm going to trust that child can come back and ask me for more when they're ready. With the 17-year-old, I might give them 2 slices at a time, and that'd be perfectly fine. So think about how you're giving information about the loss in that way. The younger developmentally the child is, the less you want to give at a time. And it's amazing how little can satisfy them. So for that 5-year-old, we might say, your friend has died. And then that child is sad. Maybe they're asking a question. Pretty soon after, they're wanting to go use their iPad or go to the playground, and that's perfectly fine. It may be a day, a week, a month, a year before they come back and they say, how did my friend die? And that's where we can give them the next bit of information. It is critical, though, that each bit of information we provide is rooted in truth. And where we see ultimately children struggle as adults with resentment toward their adult caretakers is when they were fibbed to. And oftentimes we do that in a very well meaning stance. And we don't want to hurt our child, or we don't want to create a blemish on the reputation of the deceased, or whatever the case may be that's the motivating cause. We think maybe we're doing a service to the child to not give them all of that information. And maybe we decide to withhold some information, but make sure that there's truth embedded into each bit of pizza you're serving or information that you're giving. And here's the good news. If you don't know, it's okay to say you don't know. That can be an amazing bridge builder between an adult and their child, especially those children that look at us and they think we've got it all figured out and they can never measure up and they're feeling like they're not good enough because they're not like us. We say to them, you know what? I have no idea and I wish I had an answer. How about you? You can quickly align yourself with them. Now, we always want to couple that with something that's going to give them some reassurance. So, since we don't know that and we can't answer that question, what do we know? And go back to those things that you believe to be true in life or that you're raising that child to understand and believe as well, and explore how they make sense of the world around them and then affirm that so it can cushion that not knowing. But the goal here isn't to have all the answers, and it can be a gift to model that to our children so that they know the secret's out, that we don't know it all either. A couple of other guide points for you that will promote post loss growth or post traumatic growth. First of all, I've said before, we've got to be willing to show up, to be brave, be part of the conversation. We need to use concrete language. So when we say, your person is lost or has gone, that's really difficult for a young child to understand what we mean. If they think that our grandparents lost, why aren't we out looking for them? We know through research that it's really beneficial to use the words died and dead. We're just not so comfortable doing it. So I encourage you to practice that. I believe there's nothing wrong with those words in and of themselves. It's how we deliver them that matters. And we can say those words with compassion and kindness and empathy. And then it helps the brain adjust to what's actually transpired and start to work on that grieving process of adaptation to the loss. We want to evaluate our use of platitudes. One thing that we like to say is in our meaning making process, we might use a platitude like that person is no longer suffering or they're in a better place. Those things may be true. But when we impose those on our grieving child, they may not be so sure about that. And we want them to come to that decision making on their own. So just let them lead with platitudes. If they're saying those things and it's an encouragement to them, by all means affirm it. But we want to make sure that we don't lead in those platitudes. And then resist at least statements. It sounds like this: at least you knew each other for 7 years. At least you got to see her 2 weeks ago. Those are actually minimizers. It implies that maybe we shouldn't be grieving like we are because at least we had these things. So we want to work at least out of our vocabulary when we can. And then as adults, especially when we're working with tweens and teens, consider foregoing your I stories. So sometimes we want to relate to children. And so we say, I know what you're going through. I went through this when I was your age. And then we tell them the story. And they just don't tend to hear any of that. It can be more productive for us to just let them have the spotlight and then again, let them lead. If they want to hear our I story, guess what? They will ask us. And there are some children that really do that and want to do that. Have you ever been through something like this before? And then it's our opportunity to share what we're comfortable sharing and to model that for them. That might give them hope to know that you survived it somehow. And yet we want them to lead in the process. So try and give choices where you can. The world is feeling really chaotic for young people right now, and I would say adults too. And when you can give them buy-in and decision-making power in the circumstance, it may be as simple as, we are going to go to this memorial service, but you get to choose where we stop to eat beforehand and what you want to wear. Then that child can feel a little bit empowered in the circumstance, which is helpful and will build a bridge between you. And then promote a realistic view of the deceased. In our culture, again, generally speaking, we don't speak of the dead. In the United States, we certainly don't speak ill of the dead. And there's a lot of positive qualities in that. But sometimes children get confused. I've heard from a lot of young people that feel like, maybe their parent thinks the wrong sibling died, or that they wished someone else in the family, or that they could take a place to please their parents instead of this other person dying because all they hear are positive, wonderful things about that person. It's just important for us to remember that we're all human and no one's perfect, and to maybe even sometimes talk about the tough stuff that came up in our relationship with that person who's died so that children can see it's okay to be human. And because they can put a lot of pressure on themselves after a death takes place. When they see that we are grieving and going through something hard, sometimes they want to, act like everything is fine for them because they don't want to put any extra stress on you as their caregiver. That's really common. And so that's why it's important for us to lead and to bring it up and to model what we're going through and try and do that together. So, how do we do it together? Well, activities that link that grieving child to the deceased, along with this really open communication, is going to create the best environment for post loss growth. And again, we know that through research. So think about how you can help them feel connected to the loss if it brings them comfort to do so. So, in the case of the school shooting, there's a lot of complex emotion around that. And I'm not implying that continuing to revisit that would be productive for the child. But in cases of other losses or life transitions, like changing to a new school or having a new teacher assignment, it can be helpful to link them to that person. And if you need examples of how we do that here at the Grief Center, I'll give you some ways to contact us at the end of the training, and then we'd love to help you out with that. I wanted to provide you with some resources. So if you're at your computer and want to take a screenshot, this might be a good screen for you to do that with. There are a lot of resources online that are free and available that will provide more education and information about how to support grieving young people. So any of the websites that I have listed here are worth your while to check out. Free booklets are available at the New York Life Foundation's website, two of which you're seeing here. The Golden Sweater is one in a series of books about loss that they'll send to you for free. So thank you to the New York Life Foundation for that. At the bottom there, grievingstudents.org. If you are here as a educator or staff at a school, I encourage you to visit that website. Lots of training on how to incorporate and become a grief sensitive school in the midst of all that our kids are experiencing these days. The second link there, akidsco.com, is a booklet specifically for young children related to school shootings. So if you're supporting maybe a 5 through 8-year-old, I would suggest that one. It's actually a free download and it's written by a Columbine school shooting survivor. And scholastic.com has great books and resources, as well as the National Alliance for Children's Grief, which is listed there too. And again, you can always use Alive as a resource. So, how do you know when a child needs a little bit more intervention? Even though we're saying grief is natural and normal, what if this child cannot go to school, is unwilling to leave the house? Grades have really tanked over the last few weeks and months. Well, that's what we want to look at to determine whether professional evaluation is needed. The great news is that most people will grieve just fine on their own in their communities with their support, their faith, and their family and their surroundings outside of a professional setting. But we look at the degree of functional impairment. So, how much is this impacting that child's ability to function? Then we may need some intervention if they're really not able to do their activities of daily living and be a part of their life as they were prior to the loss. We want to consider the baseline. What's the developmental level of that child before the death took place? And what does it look like now? So we're always going to use that context approach. And then sometimes professional intervention can be warranted when the guardian or caretaker of that child is having trouble coping and functioning as well. And so I think that having some professional support at the ready is always beneficial. Even if it's not going to be traditional therapy for years on end, it can be nice to know that there's support available. So, in case you weren't aware, I want to share with you that Alive serves the community at large, not just those that have used our hospice services. And if you fall anywhere within our 12 county service area, we are available to you through our grief support services. We offer telehealth and in person support. So, lots of opportunities for you as an adult and your children to connect. With regard to youth and family programs, I want to make sure that you know we do provide individual counseling for children. We offer a weekly youth group. It meets for 8 consecutive Tuesday nights at our Nashville Grief Center. It is so much fun, but also really meaningful, guided conversation about the loss with professional mental health providers. So that's something that you can look into. And then we provide support on tough days on the calendar: bereaved siblings day, Mother's Day, Father's Day, Grandparents' Day. We know that those can be really tough spots and that we can experience a peak in our grief when we encounter those dates. And so we provide support to families and children in really creative, hands on ways. And so if you'd like to learn more about any of those, we would love to add you to our mailing list. You can let us know and we'll get you that information. We also have some summer programming for children and families. The first is our Creative Hearts Club, and this is using all sorts of arts It's for 5 weeks beginning in January on Tuesday nights. We have teaching artists come in from the community to do things like sculpture and improv and music therapy. It's an amazing opportunity for young children, again, who can't articulate their experience in words to get some of those big feelings out using the creative arts. So we're excited to offer that. We have an annual camp for bereaved children. This is for any child who has experienced a death related loss in the last few years, and that can be any relationship to the person that's important to them. So it's not just a parent or a sibling, it might be a great grandmother, it might be their best friend at school. And so our camp is held at Camp Widgewagon in Antioch. It's a beautiful facility, 2 days and one overnight, and we infuse therapeutic grief support and content into the weekend. But our campers also get to do really fun things like swim and canoe and zip line and rock climb and all of the fun things that you do at camp traditionally. So for more information on that, again, another great spot to take a screenshot so you know where to find info on our camp on our website. And then we also offer a really special family retreat. It's 1 day in the fall, and families attend together. So, whatever that family constellation is, it can be great grandparents, grandparents, guardians, siblings. They all come together, enjoy a great day at camp, and then also some therapeutic memorialization and times to reflect on their loss together as a family. Because we know the more open communication about the loss for that young child, the better off they're going to fare in adulthood. As we begin to wrap up, my reminder to you is to just keep going. Remember that grief support is a long term commitment. And I don't mean that in a negative way, but sometimes we like to say, okay, I checked the box, I showed up, I asked the questions, I did great. And then we just go on with things. I'm not thinking about it. And that's our typical normal human tendency, and it's totally fine. But if we really want to show up as a grief support provider, we've got to remind ourselves periodically later down the road, maybe I should check in and see how they're doing. And of course, on those tough days like the anniversary of the death, that can be really helpful. But I also encourage you to think about the regular old Saturdays, times that people might really feel alone in their loss. Just be willing to send a text message, an email, an old school letter in the mail, whatever it is for you that works the best. There's no better time to support someone than when they pop into your mind. That might just be a prompting to check in with them and see how they're doing. Overall, I know I've given you some do this, not that, this might be helpful, this might not be helpful kind of guidelines, but I want you to know the great news is that you already have everything you need to be a wonderful grief support provider. Your willingness to take an hour and show up for this session today tells me that you're an empathic, kind, and compassionate individual that's doing your best to show up and carry the burden for someone else. That's really all you need. So, your willingness to just embrace it, let it be awkward, be willing to say, I don't have the answers either, but we're going to do this together. That is really all you need. So, on our last slide, I'm just going to share with you the ways that you can connect with the Grief Center at Alive Hospice. And if you'd like to reach out to us, if we can be of support to you in any way, you are so welcome to do that. So I can't thank you enough for choosing to spend this time with me today. And what I'd like to do now is I mentioned at the beginning of this session, I'll turn off the recording. And then if you feel ready to go and that you got what you needed, feel free to go ahead and log off the call. And if you want to linger and ask any questions, then once the recording has been turned off, you're welcome to unmute and send a question my way if you'd like. Thanks, everyone.